He laughed when the prisoner represented himself. Court gasped when he spoke. The laugh came before the words had even finished leaving the judge's mouth. The prosecutor tilted his head back, let out a short, cruel chuckle, and whispered to his colleague, "This is going to be fun." To him, the scene was a ready-made joke, an inmate in an orange jumpsuit, shackles on his ankles, calmly announcing that he would defend a cop in a high-profile trial. The defendant wasn't the inmate. The defendant was Officer Mark Hale, a patrol cop from a mid-sized American city, accused of abuse of power, assault, and evidence tampering in at least 4 cases. The media had turned Mark into the perfect face of police brutality, and the courthouse was packed. Activists on one side, angry officers on the other, cameras lined up like rifles aiming at the doors. No one in that room expected the man in chains to do anything other than embarrass himself. But Daniel Cole didn't look like a man about to humiliate himself. 34 years old, 3 years into a 15-year sentence for armed robbery, he stood up when the clerk called his name and waited for the cuffs on his wrists to be loosened just enough for him to hold a stack of loose papers. No briefcase, no suit, no polished shoes. Just state-issued sneakers and a stare that didn't waver even when it met the prosecutor's eyes. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, voice heavy with warning, "you understand that you are currently an inmate of the state, with no formal legal training, and you are asking this court to allow you to represent Officer Hale as his counsel of record?" The judge clearly expected an apology, maybe an embarrassed retreat. Instead, Daniel nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. I do understand. And yes, I will be representing Officer Hale." A wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. A woman in the second row laughed with contempt. One of the activists shook his head and whispered, "Of course they found a convict to defend a dirty cop." On the defense table, Mark Hale kept his gaze fixed on a single crack in the wood, jaw clenched so tight that a muscle in his cheek pulsed nonstop. He hadn't asked for this. When they told him in the holding cell that morning that the inmate from the Cole case wanted to defend him, his first reaction had been simple: absolutely not. The court overruled him. Before prison, Daniel had been a truck driver, not a lawyer. He'd signed more contracts than he could read, trusted more people than he should have, and paid the price for it. During his own trial, he barely spoke. His public defender did everything badly. The verdict came faster than he could process the charges. But something broke inside him the day the cell door closed. While other inmates counted days on the wall, he started counting precedents, cases, and procedures in the law library. The irony was cruel. Daniel learned how the system worked only after being crushed by it. He discovered motions no one had filed, evidence no one had requested, contradictions no one had pointed out. And buried in his own dusty file, he found one thing that never left his mind: a short, almost invisible note on an incident report: suspect unarmed at time of arrest. Officer M. Hale. A line that had disappeared from the documents presented to the jury. So when Daniel heard, months later, the name Officer Mark Hale echoing through the prison yard, linked to a new scandal, something didn't add up. The same cop who had marked suspect unarmed on his report was now accused of planting weapons at crime scenes. The city wanted a monster. The prosecution needed an example. Internal Affairs needed a scapegoat. And strangely, nobody seemed interested in the details. Back in the courtroom, the judge let out a long sigh. Very well. The court will allow it, against its better judgment. Mr. Cole, you will be held to the same standards as any licensed attorney. If you waste this court's time, I will end this arrangement immediately. Understood. Understood, Your Honor. The prosecutor stood for his opening statement with the confident smile of someone who knew the crowd was already on his side. He painted a picture of a cop who thought he was above the law, who beat suspects, manipulated reports, and destroyed lives in poor neighborhoods. He didn't need to try very hard. The country was ready to believe. Every sentence pushed the jury a little further in the direction of anger. When it was Daniel's turn, the tension changed color. The gallery leaned forward, hungry for a disaster. An inmate defending a cop. If that wasn't an announced tragedy, what was? Daniel walked to the center of the room, the chain at his ankle clinking with each step, and faced the jurors. "My name is Daniel Cole," he began, his accent carrying the weight of neighborhoods that rarely win in court. 3 years ago, this system decided I was exactly what I look like to you right now, a criminal in a jumpsuit. He let that hang in the air, without rushing. The officer sitting over there, he gestured without looking at Mark, was the one who put the cuffs on me. So if you're wondering why I'm standing here defending him instead of hating him, you're not alone. One of the jurors raised an eyebrow slightly. Another crossed her arms, defensive, as if refusing to be manipulated by cheap rhetoric. Daniel noticed, but didn't back down. You've heard the story they want you to believe, he continued. Officer Hale as the perfect villain. Maybe he is. Maybe he isn't. What I'm asking you to do for just a few days is something nobody did for me. Look at what's missing. The report that vanished. The complaint that disappeared from the internal system. The timing that doesn't make sense unless someone wanted a cop out of the way. He didn't promise to prove anything there, not yet. He did something far more dangerous, planted doubt where conviction already seemed guaranteed. And as he walked back to the defense table, the courtroom no longer saw just a corrupt cop and a desperate prisoner. It saw a crack. A flaw in the comfortable script. Why would a man in chains risk what little life he still had to defend the cop who arrested him? That was a question that started to bother the jury even before the first witness was called. And if you want to find out what Daniel knows that nobody else noticed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's going to be exposed in the next hearings isn't just about a cop or a prisoner, it's about who really controls the verdict before it's read. The first witness the prosecution called was Detective Raymond Torres, a 20-year veteran with a chest full of commendations and a reputation for closing cases that other cops couldn't crack. He walked to the stand with the posture of a man who had testified hundreds of times, confident that his word carried the weight of authority. The prosecutor wasted no time. Detective Torres, you worked alongside Officer Hale for how long? 6 years, give or take. And during that time, did you ever witness behavior from Officer Hale that concerned you? Torres shifted in his seat, eyes flicking briefly toward Mark before settling back on the prosecutor. Yes. Multiple times. Mark had a tendency to get aggressive during arrests. More than necessary. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. Can you describe a specific incident? There was a case about 2 years ago. Suspect was resisting, but he was already on the ground. Mark kept his knee on the guy's back longer than protocol allows. I told him to ease up. He didn't listen until the suspect stopped moving. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor let the moment breathe, then asked, "Did you report this?" "I should have. I didn't." Torres looked genuinely regretful, the perfect repentant witness. "I told myself it was just stress, that Mark was going through a rough divorce. I didn't want to destroy his career over one mistake." But it wasn't just one mistake, was it? No. After that, I started paying closer attention. There were inconsistencies in his reports. Items showing up in evidence logs that I didn't remember seeing at the scene. I brought it up to him once. He got defensive, told me to mind my own business. The jury was eating it up. Torres had credibility, calm delivery, and just enough self-blame to seem honest rather than vindictive. When the prosecutor finished, he looked at Daniel with barely concealed amusement. "Your witness." Daniel stood slowly, papers in hand, and approached the stand. He didn't look angry or defensive. He looked curious. "Detective Torres," Daniel began, voice neutral, "you said you worked with Officer Hale for 6 years. That's a long time to work closely with someone." "It is." "During those 6 years, how many arrests did you two make together? Approximate number." Torres frowned, clearly not expecting the question. "I don't know. Maybe 200? 300? Let's say 250. And out of those 250 arrests, how many times did you report concerns about Officer Hale's conduct?" "I told you, I didn't report." "Right. 0 times." Daniel let that sit for a moment. "But you just testified that there were multiple times you witnessed concerning behavior. So, out of 250 arrests, multiple incidents concerned you enough to remember them years later, but not enough to file a single report. Is that correct?" Torres's jaw tightened. "I explained why I didn't report it." "You said it was because of his divorce. When did that divorce happen?" "I don't remember the exact date." Daniel pulled a sheet from his stack. "Officer Hale's divorce was finalized in March of 2021. The incident you described, the one with the suspect on the ground, happened in October of 2023. That's 2.5 years after the divorce ended." So the divorce couldn't have been the reason you didn't report it, could it? The prosecutor stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Overruled, the judge said, leaning forward with renewed interest. Answer the question, Detective. Torres hesitated. I may have gotten the timeline wrong. The point is, I saw what I saw. Daniel nodded slowly. You saw what you saw. Let me ask you this. The case you just described, the one from October 2023, do you remember the suspect's name? No. Do you remember the charge? It was a drug case, I think. You think? Daniel placed another paper on the evidence table. I have the arrest log from that month. There were 11 arrests involving you and Officer Hale. None of them involved a suspect being held on the ground for an extended period. In fact, the only complaint filed during that entire month came from a suspect who claimed that another officer, not Hale, used excessive force. That officer's name was deleted from the public report, but the internal file still has it. Would you like me to read it? Torres went pale. The courtroom, which had been leaning toward conviction moments ago, was now dead silent. Detective Torres, Daniel continued, his voice colder now, isn't it true that you filed an internal complaint against Officer Hale not because of excessive force, but because he reported you for taking money from evidence lockup? That's a lie. Is it? Because I have the original complaint that Officer Hale filed on September 8, 2023. It was submitted to Internal Affairs, and it named you specifically for mishandling evidence in 3 separate cases. 2 weeks later, your complaint against him appeared. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? The prosecutor shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is baseless speculation. The defense has provided no evidence that Detective Torres. I have the IA file, Daniel interrupted, holding up a thin folder. It was never acted on because someone buried it. But it exists. And it shows that every accusation against Officer Hale started after he tried to do the right thing. The judge gestured for the folder. Daniel handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. As the judge flipped through the pages, his expression darkened. Counsel, approach, the judge ordered. Both the prosecutor and Daniel walked to the bench. The conversation was whispered, but the tension was visible. When they returned to their places, the judge looked at Torres with something close to disgust. Detective Torres, I'm ordering you to remain available for further questioning. This court will be investigating the validity of these documents. You are dismissed for now. Torres left the stand, his confident stride replaced by a stiff, defensive shuffle. The jury watched him go, and the doubt that Daniel had planted in his opening statement was now growing roots. Mark Hale, for the first time since the trial began, looked up. He stared at Daniel, confusion and something else, maybe gratitude, maybe fear, flickering across his face. But Daniel didn't look back. He was already preparing for the next witness, because he knew that exposing one dirty cop wasn't going to be enough. The prosecution had built a fortress of lies, and he needed to dismantle it brick by brick. And the next brick was about to crack in a way that no one in that courtroom was ready for. Because if Daniel was right, this wasn't just about Mark Hale. It was about a system that had learned to protect itself by feeding its own to the wolves whenever the public demanded blood. And the person pulling the strings wasn't sitting in the defendant's chair. They were sitting somewhere much higher, watching the trial unfold, confident that no one would ever look up. The prosecution's next star was Officer Lisa Brennan, the forensic tech who had processed 3 of the scenes where Hale supposedly planted guns. On paper, she was unbeatable. Clean record, certifications, chain of custody forms lined up like soldiers. In the witness chair, though, she kept glancing at a man in a cheap gray suit sitting alone in the back row. The prosecutor guided her like a script. Brennan explained the dust patterns, the disturbed surfaces, the clear signs that the guns had been placed there after the arrests. She said Hale was the last one on scene in 2 cases, that his access and the forensics aligned perfectly. The jury followed every word, already building the image of Hale as the quiet monster. When it was his turn, Daniel didn't attack. He asked her to walk him through the science again. How long for that dust ring to form? A few days. Maybe a week. How much time between the arrests and her processing of the Caldwell Street scene? 1 day. He let the math hang in the air. So either the dust in that apartment ages in dog years, he said, or your conclusion doesn't match the timeline. The prosecutor objected. The judge waved it off. Brennan's eyes went straight to the man in the gray suit. He gave a tiny shake of the head. Her voice thinned. I may have been mistaken about the time frame. In all 3 reports? Daniel asked. All 3 scenes where Hale was suddenly your villain. He didn't shout. He just pulled one more thread. Do you know a man named Karl Novak? Her face answered before she did. Yes. Did Mr. Novak ever guide your conclusions? Daniel asked. Specifically in Officer Hale's cases? The silence said everything. Then, barely above a whisper, he said we needed the reports to line up. That Internal Affairs was counting on it. The room erupted. The judge had to slam the gavel 3 times before ordering Brennan held on suspicion of perjury and evidence tampering. As the bailiff led her away in tears, the man in the gray suit tried to slip toward the exit. Your Honor, Daniel said calmly, handing the bailiff a note, the defense calls Karl Novak. Every eye followed the man as he froze mid-step. Novak took the stand looking like someone who just realized the fire alarm wasn't a drill. Daniel walked him through the basics, his role over the evidence division, his access to every log, every report, every photo. Then came the knife. Did you alter the forensic reports in Officer Hale's cases? Novak's private lawyer tried to jump in, waving around the Fifth Amendment like a shield. The judge shut it down. If he stayed silent, the court would assume the worst. So Novak talked. He didn't confess because he wanted to. He confessed because 30 years of hiding behind forms and signatures had not prepared him for a prisoner who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. He admitted adjusting language. He admitted clarifying conclusions. And when Daniel asked who had ordered him to do it, the name finally landed. Captain Ellison. The same man who ran Internal Affairs. The man everyone trusted to clean up dirty cops. The man Daniel had suspected since the first time he read his own file and realized how many hands had touched the truth before it reached a judge. As the jury processed that bomb, the judge ordered an immediate recess and had U.S. Marshals sent to bring Ellison in. The prosecution table looked like someone had pulled the tablecloth out from under their case and taken half the dishes with it. Daniel sat back, not triumphant, just very, very tired. Exposing one bad cop was never the point. The point was to show who had been arranging the pieces, deciding which names got branded criminal, and which got quietly promoted. And the man at the top of that pyramid was about to find out what it felt like to be the one under the microscope. Captain Frank Ellison walked into the courtroom like he owned the building. Silver hair, perfect posture, the calm arrogance of a man who had spent decades deciding which careers lived and died. He took the oath like it was a formality and told the jury exactly what they were supposed to hear: for serious complaints, a thorough investigation, and a department bravely holding its own accountable. When Daniel stood, the atmosphere shifted. No more sideshow. This was the confrontation the whole city didn't know it had been waiting for. Captain, Daniel began, how many complaints does an average officer in a high-crime district get over 12 years? Ellison didn't know. Daniel did. He quoted the department's own internal stats, about 7. Hale had 4, all previously closed without discipline. Below average until, magically, every old complaint came roaring back to life after he started handing Internal Affairs proof of missing money and dirty colleagues. So for 12 years, Daniel said, your office found nothing worth disciplining. Then, 3 weeks after Hale reports corruption, he suddenly becomes the most dangerous man in uniform. That's quite a conversion. Ellison blamed new evidence. Wrong choice of words. Daniel pulled out the email. It wasn't dramatic, just a plain printout, thin black text on government letterhead, but as soon as he read the subject line out loud, the room leaned in. Hale's situation needs immediate resolution. Then the body, orders to discredit Hale, to act before he talked to the feds, and the phrase that sucked all the air out of the room: use whatever you have. Fabricate if necessary. The prosecutor tried to argue context. The judge demanded to know why those emails had been buried from both the defense and the court. The answer, we didn't think they were relevant, nearly got him held in contempt on the spot. Ellison called Novak a liar, called the email misinterpreted, fell back on the oldest shield in the playbook: I did what I had to do to protect the department. Daniel didn't let him hide there. He walked the court through one of Hale's side investigations, $340,000 from a forfeiture case that vanished between the seizure and the city's books. The only office with the power to reroute that money? Ellison's. The only officer who had noticed and started asking questions? Hale. You weren't afraid Hale would destroy the department, Daniel said. You were afraid he'd destroy your little side business. For a second, Ellison dropped the mask. He leaned forward and hissed, "You're just an inmate in a costume. You think anyone believes you over me?" Daniel didn't blink. "I don't need belief, Captain. I have your own words and your own email server." It was over after that. The judge ordered Ellison into custody, called for federal investigators, and did the thing nobody in that room had expected at the start of the week: dismissed every charge against Mark Hale with prejudice and declared a mistrial built on rotten foundations. The gavel hit. The room buzzed like a broken transformer. Hale sat there, stunned, tears he didn't bother to hide trailing down his face. For months, he had been the city's favorite villain. In a single afternoon, the story flipped. He was the guy who tried to clean up his own house and got thrown into the fire for it. He mouthed thank you to Daniel. Daniel just nodded once. Vindication tasted different when you were still wearing chains. And before he could even process the fact that he had just dismantled Internal Affairs from the wrong side of a bulletproof glass line, 2 federal agents were already stepping into his path, offering something the court hadn't. A way out that didn't end at a prison gate. They didn't march Daniel back to general population. They took him to a quiet conference room, sat him across from 2 federal agents, and slid a folder across the metal table like it was just another form in a world made of forms. Agent Ward did the talking. She laid it out clean. His testimony and documents had just cracked open a federal case they'd been building in secret. If he kept cooperating, kept testifying, kept explaining how the game was rigged from the bottom, they could push for a sentence reduction. Maybe even time served. Daniel had imagined freedom 100 times in his bunk at night. None of those versions had included a badge asking him to help dismantle the same system that had stamped his file dangerous, and moved on. He asked about Hale first. On paper, Hale would be cleared, reinstated, probably compensated. Off the record, he'd be a problem nobody wanted back on the payroll, a walking reminder that if you report the wrong people, you'd better be ready to stand in court with an inmate at your side. "And me?" Daniel asked. "What do I look like out there?" "A consultant," Ward said. "Someone who knows where the paperwork doesn't match the street. If you want to study law, we'll back it. You've done more real cross-examination in 3 days than some attorneys do in 10 years. He almost laughed at that. The same system that had laughed when he picked up his first law book in prison now wanted him to use what he'd learned, officially. He had one condition: he didn't want just an early release. He wanted his name back. A shot at clearing the original conviction, proving that the same people who tried to bury Hale had laid the groundwork in his case too. Ward didn't sugarcoat it. Hard but possible, if the evidence was there. If the pattern held. He thought of all the nights in the law library, the files he'd pored over, the details that hadn't made sense until he'd seen Ellison's email. Thought of the other inmates who'd never have the chance he had now. Then he signed. The funny part, he admitted out loud, was that the prosecutor had been right about one thing: a prisoner representing himself should have been a massacre. Instead, it turned out the system had accidentally trained him for this. When you live at the bottom of a machine built to crush you, you either learn every moving part, or you don't survive. By evening, the prison gate rolled open. No reporters, no cheering crowd. Just air that didn't taste like bleach and metal, and a sky that didn't have bars around it. Mark Hale was waiting by an old sedan, out of uniform, out of a job, out of illusions. They looked at each other like 2 people who had seen the same monster from different sides. "I heard you're going to help them go after the rest," Hale said. "Seems like they finally realized who's been doing the homework," Daniel answered. Hale handed him a small envelope, money pooled by the few good cops who still had a conscience. Not enough to change a life, but enough to make sure his first night of freedom didn't end under a bridge. "Careful," Daniel said. "If they keep finding out you do decent things, they'll never let you back in the club." "Too late," Hale replied. "They already decided I switched sides." Daniel looked out at the city, corrupt, chaotic, still dangerous, but no longer untouchable. "Good," he said. "Means you finally picked the right one." He'd gone into that courtroom as a punchline, the prisoner arrogant enough to think he could play lawyer. He walked away as something the people at the top fear far more than a good attorney, someone who saw the worst of the machine from the inside, learned its language, and was now loose with a microphone and time. He tried to destroy Daniel, but ended up destroying himself. Daniel learned that real revenge isn't just proving them wrong, it's rising so far above the lie they told about you that one day, even your enemies have to choke on their own version of the story. And if you want to follow more stories where the system thinks it already wrote the ending, only to find out way too late that it picked the wrong protagonist, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stick around, because this was just the first time they laughed at a prisoner, and left the courthouse without finding it funny at all.